And then I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Sally Snyder. I am, pronouns are she, hers. And this is my dog, Decimal, right here. He wanted to join me tonight. I'm with the Diversity Programming Board at Rogue Community College. And I'm also here with Nicole Selinger, who's going to thank our sponsors for us.
Thanks, Sally. This program was made possible in part by a grant from Oregon Humanities, which is a statewide nonprofit organization and an independent affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, which funds Oregon Humanities Grant Program. For 50 years, Oregon Humanities has offered programs and publications that help Oregonians connect, reflect, and learn from one another. We are joined this evening for a presentation by the Rogue Action Center and Fair Housing Council in partnership with Neighbors for Neighbors of Josephine County and RCC. This evening we'll open up with some history around fair housing laws and talk a little bit about how to promote an inclusive community through YIMBY culture, and share several tips on how to be an effective advocate for yourself and others in our communities as relates to housing and shelter needs. We'll also offer a long list of tools, groups, and resources to get involved in locally. And then at the end, we should have time for question and response. And so please feel free to use the chat box throughout this session. And we should have ample time at the end for question, response, and interaction. If you have any questions, again, you can message me directly or Sally. And one of the groups I want to encourage you to join, if you are unable to stay for the entirety of this session, or if you're just really interested and inspired to learn more, is the Neighbors for Neighbors of Josephine County. We are an education, advocacy, and community building program specific to our communities here in Josephine County, where you can learn more about housing advocacy, equitable housing, and other opportunities for engagement, volunteering, and events.
All right, thank you. Let's see, try and get my little slide to advance and nothing's happening. Let's try. Here we go. Okay, so I wanted to go over our mission, which is to enrich, support, and celebrate our diverse community by acting as a catalyst for inclusion, continuous learning, understanding, and acceptance through active engagement and facilitation of educational opportunities that challenge biases and deepen conversations. And pretty soon I'm going to put a link in the chat for an evaluation form. So if you are able to stay through the whole program tonight, then you can fill that out later at the end of the program, and we'll post it again. If you're not able to stay for the whole thing, we'd still like you to click on it for us and give us any information you can so we can keep bringing you programs that are relevant and that you're interested in. Okay, so without further ado, I'd now like to introduce Dana, and she will be giving you a full introduction of herself.
Hi there, let me just switch over to my presentation. My name is Dana and I am with the Rogue Action Center and I use she, her pronouns. All right. Can you see my whole presentation, Sally?
Yes, except you're not quite in full view.
Okay, let me.
There you go, thank you.
Okay, and let me just see. I can, whoops. Did that change it or is it still okay?
No, it went back. Did you need your speaker notes?
Yeah.
Okay, I think there was the one at the top had speaker notes for you.
Okay.
If you go to the top of the three dots, I saw something for speaker notes.
Yes.
And if you can see them now, don't worry about it. It's
okay.
fine.
I will just go with it. Okay. Thank you for bearing with me here. Let's see. All right, well, as I get this figured out, we can start with the poll. So we just wanted to, we don't have time to do introductions for everyone in the room, but we did want to give an opportunity for folks to just share a few things about themselves. So Sally's going to post or prompt a poll for everyone. This is anonymous, and of course there's no right answers, but it'll just help us all get a sense of a little bit more of who's in the room.
Sally, I didn't have the opportunity to actually click on a response. I saw a results page pop up.
Oh, that's because you're as a co-host. So this will only post for people who are in not as co-hosts.
Mine went away. I was just clicking on the first one and it disappeared.
Huh. Okay, maybe somebody ended it. I will relaunch. How about that?
How's that? Good.
Okay. And if you're in here as a guest, as an audience member, and you do not see it, let us know.
Repairs on the front Spence Bridge, and in Louisiana, the Cockasoo Bridge in desperate need of a fix. But the White House acknowledges any.
And if everyone would mind just muting, making sure they're muted. Thank you.
Oh, there, I see answers coming in. And if you're not sure about the very last question, just do your best. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and I think we're there. Let me scroll through. Yep. Okay, and I'm just going to share out our results. So have you ever struggled to find any of the following? We've had most people here have struggled to find affordable housing. You can see.
We're going to be talking about electric vehicles, given those poll.
Have you ever attended city council or county commissioners meeting? Have you written letters or any other advocacy steps? And then I was really most interested in this one. Who is a dog person? Okay, I see it's kind of a mixed room. Thanks. Okay, got it.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing. Okay. Is this looking okay now, Sally?
Actually, I can see your notes. If you expand your that one.
Okay.
Like with your, I think you're sharing your whole screen right now. So.
Okay.
If you just share the window, we'll get there. Yeah, you did it. If you can see your notes, we're all set to go.
Okay. All right. Well, as I said, my name is Dana and I work at the Rogue Action Center and I use she, her pronouns. And so, let's see, here we go. So the Rogue Action Center was founded in 2017 by folks in Jackson and Josephine County, really out of a need for a space where organizers and leaders could collaborate on issues of affordable housing and climate justice and just creating a community that was more safe and inclusive for everybody. And since our founding, we've been working with communities on addressing those issues. And for the past year, we've also been really deeply engaged in mutual aid fire relief work after the Alameda and Open Chain fires. And so we are talking about affordable and accessible housing today. And again, thanks for filling out that poll. As we can all see, a lot of us have struggled with finding or maintaining affordable and fair housing. And of course, your lived experiences are really the most important story about the state of housing in Josephine County. But we also just wanted to share some statistics, just some numbers to give another perspective of where we're at right now. So as you can see from the graph, according to data from the Oregon Housing Alliance from last year, 2020, about 1 in 3 renters in Josephine County are paying more than 50% of their income on rent. And 3 out of 4, so about 75% of renters with extremely low income are paying more than 50% of their income in rent. And in the affordable housing policy world, we use the term rent burdened to kind of classify households that are paying over 30% of their income in rent, and severely rent burdened for folks that are paying over 50% of their income in rent. So as we can see from this, just a huge number of folks, especially folks who are extremely low income, are really severely rent burdened. Another really powerful statistic is that, or just number, is that the median home value for a house in Josephine County in 2020 was roughly $328,000, which is a 13.3% increase from just the year before, from 2019. So the prices are rising at a rate that our wages can't keep up with. And according to this data, someone working a minimum wage job would have to work 69 hours a week to afford just a 2-bedroom apartment. And of course, the housing crisis is about more than simply supply and demand, and we can't solve it just by building more affordable housing, right? At the heart of the crisis is building the right kind of housing that meets the needs of the folks in our community. A study by the Daily Courier in 2017 found that fewer than 100 apartment units have been built in Grants Pass over the 10 years prior. And during that same period, close to 1,000 full homes have been built. And quickly, a lot of those were sold to investors or retirees from outside the area. So the result of this direction in the housing market is that there are not enough units, not enough homes to meet the needs of the folks that live in the community. And the final graph up there, the one on the left that shows all the houses, represents that for every 100 families with extremely low income, there are only 32 affordable units, which puts the county 1,855 units short, which is a pretty immense number. And one of the reasons that we've ended up with this imbalance in housing is because of who is represented at decision-making tables and who is not. Oftentimes, voices from the community, especially those of renters, are not part of the decision-making process. And unfortunately, the people who are showing up and influencing decision makers are developers and real estate folks from the real estate industry, and those who already know how to navigate the system and have profits as their central motivation and not necessarily the needs of the community. So this results in a gap between what is being built and what is needed. And if you're starting to wonder why there aren't laws that require affordable housing and require public participation from the community members, well, there actually are. A lot of you, some of you may know, some of you may not, that Oregon has a land use system in place that is supposed to be used as a guide by cities when They're making decisions around development, and there are 19 land use planning goals. And Sam is going to share some information about another one of those goals during his presentation, but I'm just going to briefly touch on goal 1, which is concerned with community involvement. So according to goal 1 of the Oregon land use planning goals, it's actually legally required that city governments involve the public at every stage of the land use planning process. So although we're not always given the tools or information that we need to participate in these decisions, we have a right to be in those spaces, share our experiences, and ask for what we want. And so at the end of the evening, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we address this crisis, how we can influence the decisions that are being made, and a lot of different ways to plug in. But for the time being, I am going to pass it over to Sam, and he's going to talk about fair housing and accessibility, and we'll circle back. So Sam, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks so much, Dana, and thank you to Neighbors for Neighbors for the invite for me to be here. I'm Samuel Goldberg. I'm an education and outreach specialist at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. I use he, him pronouns. If you were here last week, there was a great fair housing presentation from Seth Kirby from UCAN, who is someone that we work with extensively. So I will retread a little bit of his presentation, but in the interest of time, it's going to be pretty quick. We're going to mostly talk about its impacts on the land use system, the interlocking fair housing needs and affordable housing needs, and how both of those things can work together to further the goals of both. So a little bit about the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. We are a statewide civil rights organization. We proactively promote housing justice, equity, and inclusion, and we do that through education and enforcement of fair housing law. So what are fair housing laws? They are civil rights laws, just like the right to vote, just like the right to public accommodations. They promote equal access to housing. They make it illegal for housing providers to discriminate against certain groups. Those groups being protected classes. And we are all a member of a protected class. And I'll get into those a little bit in a second, but yeah, fundamentally it's different from landlord-tenant law. Landlord-tenant laws, governing the relationship between you and your landlord. If your landlord was treating you different on the basis of a protected class, then it would become a fair housing issue. And these laws apply to everyone who touches the housing market, and that ranges from landlords to realtors to jurisdictions. When jurisdictions make laws that and rules and regulations that have to deal with housing, then they are subject to the Fair Housing Act. So fair housing discrimination, as I said, means treating a person differently because that person is a member of protected class. Federally, those are race, color, national origin, and religion. Those are the original 4 in the 1968 Fair Housing Act. Sex was added in 1974. Families with children, familial status, that was added in 1988. For those of you who were around and engaging with the rental market, you may remember that before 1988, it was very difficult to find rental housing if you had children. Something like 75% of all rental housing was no pets, no children. That was a very common thing to see in listings. And disability was also added in 1988. And those two things are a little bit different from the rest of the protected classes because they have some additional protections. It's not simply that you can't treat a person differently in the same way as race, color, national origin, but because of the specific needs of those two protected classes, there's a little bit of extra protection that I will get into because it has to do with what we are dealing with in our housing market. Oregon also has some additional protected classes: marital status, source of income. This is a big one, again, related to what we're talking about today, because it means that since 2014, landlords can't say no Section 8, or jurisdictions can't make decisions on rejecting a housing project because they serve people who are using agency checks or something other than a traditional job for their income. So that is against the law in the state of Oregon, and it has major implications on what we're going to be talking about. Sexual orientation and gender identity, that is actually something that is now protected at the federal level as well under the protection of sex, but Oregon has been protecting it separately for a while. And then there's local protected classes. I'm sorry, I forgot to see if Grants Pass had any additional ones, but a lot of times in college towns, you will see that age over 18 is a protected class, because you'll run into this problem where, in a college town, a lot of landlords will say, well, it's, we only rent to people over 24 or something like that. So in a lot of Oregon communities, age over 18 also has to be an additional protected class so that they can serve the needs of younger renters. So I want to talk very briefly about the history of residential segregation in Oregon and how we got to the housing situation that we see right now. So you could go all the way back to the beginning, before Oregon statehood even. White settlement of the Oregon Territory relied on decimation of 80% of the native population, people who had been here for thousands of years. And most of those who remained were forced onto reservations. So we see very quickly how government policy is separating different populations. And then we have the Donation Land Act of 1850, which gave 320 acres to single men and 640 acres to married couples. This is even before the Homestead Act. If you remember your American history classes, the Homestead Act, which enabled the settlement of the Great Plains. Well, we had a version of that in Oregon even before that. And you can imagine what 320 acres or 640 acres of land in Oregon would be worth in today's valuation of that. So we see how government policy is creating these different strata based on who you are, who your identity is. And then we have that even more enshrined in the state constitution of 1859. Oregon was the only state in our history that actually prevented an entire race of people from settling here in the Constitution. So African Americans who were not a resident of the state at the time of the Constitution were prevented from entering. It did not matter if they were enslaved or free. We came in as a free state, but with this huge exclusionary clause in the Constitution. And this was actually not nullified until 1927. So it was continued during that period of the early 20th century when African Americans were leaving the South, fleeing violence and looking for opportunity and coming to places like the West Coast, but they largely avoided Oregon because of this exclusionary clause. And the Constitution also explicitly barred Chinese from owning property or having mining claims in their own names. And this was not nullified until 1943, when China was our ally during World War II. But in spite of those, I do not want to give the impression that no African Americans or other immigrants came to Oregon. Like everywhere that had a booming economy at the time of our statehood, people were looking for opportunities, and we had a lot of them in mining and agriculture and timber. And so you start to see these stable communities forming across the state, including in places like Grants Pass. small African-American communities. Chinatowns were very common throughout Oregon. And then, so a lot of these start to form from the 1850s to the 1880s, and then something something happens in American culture around the time that time where you have a series of economic recessions, and these minority communities became the scapegoats. And so they were driven out by violence and intimidation and what were called sundown laws. And this was a really common tactic that you might be familiar with, where they would say whites only within city limits after dark. And so it was this intimidation tactic to try and get rid of minority communities and push them out. And there are stories of Grants Pass's sundown laws lasting well into the 20th century. And so where there was the beginnings of these stable minority communities, these were pushed out between 1890 and 1930. And then you have this relationship solidified with what were called restrictive covenants, and they prevented the owner of real estate to sell or transfer property to non-whites. So this was something that was actually in the deeds of houses that said that in perpetuity, this property cannot be sold to a Black person or a Chinese person, or take your pick of any non-white group. And these were declared unenforceable by the state in 1948. However, they lasted well beyond that in private transactions. So even though the state wasn't enforcing these after 1948, realtors and property owners were very much still honoring it. And those were not nullified until 1959 at the state level and 1968 at the federal level. So if you live in a house from before 1959 in Oregon, I definitely recommend checking out your deed at the county and seeing if it has one of these restrictive covenants. So all of these explicitly racist, explicitly classist policies that sorted our communities into these people live over here, these people live over here, they were solidified by institutional practices. So the Federal Housing Administration, which created the housing market that we know of today, the home purchasing terms of 20% down and paying it off over 30 years. That was, a great New Deal era innovation that put home buying within reach of a lot of people, but they incorporated all of those racially restrictive practices. So the FHA wouldn't even back a home loan if it didn't have a restrictive covenant, for instance, or they wouldn't subsidize a new suburban development unless all of those houses included a racially restrictive covenant. So as a result, only 2% of the loans that the FHA backed between 1934 and 1963 went to non-whites. So a huge discrepancy. We also see that in VA loan policies, the GI Bill, which created home opportunities for returning World War II veterans, that was largely unavailable to non-white GIs. Urban renewal, that's something that you see, especially in the 1950s and 60s, that took the form of oftentimes like highway construction or new office development. That was very much, very often, the footprint of that would follow wherever minority communities lived under the guise of slum clearance. And then perhaps most extensive and most damaging, and what I'm going to talk about today, is this concept of exclusionary zoning. So before the 1920s, before zoning was really formalized, there were various types of housing that were allowed in all different parts of a city. So, things like duplexes and triplexes and mid-rises, they were allowed pretty much throughout a city, especially around commercial cores. But when you have exclusionary zoning, these exclusionary zoning regimes that we're still dealing with today, it was very much the areas where mostly white people lived were reserved for single family residential. And then the areas that were really close to industrial uses and the areas where mostly people of color lived, those were the rare reserves that were left for multifamily development. And so you see this really serious concentration and separation of people on the basis of protected class, and probably most insidiously, and the reason that we have it today, is that those zoning policies don't say anything about race. They're on the footprints of a racist regime, but they don't have to say anything explicit in order to perpetuate that system. And here's the continuing impacts of that today. So it restricts lower cost or higher density housing to those rare multifamily zones, which again tend to be away from economically prosperous areas. And it limits racial and economic diversity because of that. And it raises housing costs. You know, you're restricting huge areas of the city to this low density development, and that artificially, you know, raises the value of those houses. So lesson number one that we take from this history: racial segregation didn't happen organically. It was a result of decades of violence, intimidation, and prejudice, and then it was cemented by institutional actions. So my call to action for that would be learn the specific history of your area and then press for institutional actions to redress that harm. So when you are, when there is this opportunity, the opportunities that are presented to us to build new housing, make sure that housing are the right types of housing and that they're going into areas that could actually minimize the historical harms that we have seen through exclusionary zoning. So as Dana mentioned, I'm going to talk about Goal 10. Goal 10 is the piece of Senate Bill 100, which set up our state land use system, which deals with housing. And Goal 10 says that to provide for the housing needs of citizens of the state, buildable lands and residential use shall be inventoried, and plans shall encourage the availability of adequate numbers of needed housing units at price ranges and rent levels which are commensurate with the financial capabilities of Oregon households and allow for flexibility of housing location, type, and density. So that really says it all. Not only do cities have to address the housing needs of the people who live in their community, they actually need to address the future needs for the next 20 years. And simply saying we're going to build more single family housing isn't enough. It has to be in line with what people can actually afford, the people who actually live in the community can afford, and the types of housing that they need. So that really says it all. And that is really the core of any land use decision that involves housing that a city makes. So what's the intersection with fair housing? Well, there's definitely a link between affordable housing and fair housing. Very often by segregating by income, which is what I was talking about with separating out different neighborhoods that are exclusively single family and multifamily, that can be a proxy for segregating by protected class. Not exclusively, but very often, members of these protected classes may not be able to afford the housing types that other people can. And it also requires a housing needs analysis in Goal 10 that encourage more housing types. So these housing needs analysis, a city's supposed to do, it's pretty soon, it's going to be every 3 years, I believe. And so they're supposed to be continually analyzing the needs of the community and making sure that the housing that's getting built is what the community actually needs. And then, of course, in 2019, we had House Bill 2001. Oregon became the first state in the country to take this really historic step to end exclusionary single-family zoning. And in Grants Pass, which is considered a large city under this the standard of House Bill 2001, duplexes are going to be allowed on all single-family lots, and other middle housing types will be allowed in all zones, and this has to happen by July of 2022. So this means triplexes, quadplexes, cottage clusters, and townhouses. So this is a really big step to addressing the types of segregation that we've seen in the past. But at the same time, in 2019, and this law actually, I think, tends to get overshadowed, and that's House Bill 2003. So House Bill 2003 requires cities with a population of 10,000 or greater to create a housing production strategy. And that strategy must include a list of actions a city will take to promote the development of all identified housing needs. So this is actually finally putting teeth to this concept of housing needs. Cities have been supposed to keep track of their needs for a long time, but they didn't really have to tell the state how they were going to meet those needs. And now they have to do that. So the Department of Land Conservation and Development, or DLCD, which is the state agency that regulates land use, they have a whole menu of options that cities are supposed to at least look at and say, well, these are the strategies that we're going to take to meet the housing needs of our community. So Grants Pass, in Grants Pass, the new 2001 code, that middle housing code, is going to have to be in place by July of next year. This housing production strategy is 1 year after that. So because of Goal 1, which Dana did a great job of outlining, both of these things, you as residents of Grants Pass have an opportunity to be a part of, to get involved in that decision making and advocate for policies that are going to do the most to get us to where we need to be, both in terms of affordable housing supply and accessible housing supply. And regarding accessible housing, I do want to take a couple minutes to talk about that specifically, because I think it's something that we're not quite aware the scale of the need. So this graph is from the Sightline Institute, and it tracks the annual growth of Oregonians over age 75. Now, obviously, not all people with disabilities, or especially mobility-related disabilities, are seniors, but they are the drivers of seniors are the drivers of where the growth in that mobility-related disabilities are. So as we can see, as the population gets a lot older, we need a lot more units. In Oregon, we need to be producing 6,781 wheelchair-ready units a year, every year, and this is just to meet the new growth. This is not even addressing the needs that we already have. And it is much more affordable to build those units accessible from the start than have to do a costly retrofit later. So this is something that we need to start thinking about right now, and it's something that that you as community members can continually bring up, hammer that home when we are talking to when you're talking to city leaders and city officials. So here's some strategies. So most accessible units are in multifamily developments today. And the reason for that is because housing and urban development requires that any housing that is 4 units or more has to have at least one unit, ground level unit, that is fully accessible. So because of that, that means pretty much all accessible units are in multifamily zones. But because of middle housing, bringing in things like cottage clusters, quadplexes, and townhouses into single family zones, there is suddenly a huge opportunity to put accessible units in all zones, spread out across the city. And I want to be clear that 1 for every 4 units, that's a floor. That's the minimum that HUD requires. If you can advocate to your city, hey, let's offer incentives to build more accessible units, because as you've seen, the need is so staggering. Absolutely, get like try and get more incentives. And accessible units can also be prioritized for people with disabilities as a preference policy. So as I mentioned, families with children and people with disabilities, those are the only 2 protected classes where you can actually go above and beyond simply saying you can't discriminate on this. So Portland's ADU code since last year has said that these accessory dwelling units, because they are primarily accessible, they're built to accessible standards, then you can landlords actually must put in a preference policy for people with disabilities for those units to make sure that the people who most need the units are getting the first crack at it. So lesson number 2, Goaltend means that producing adequate quantities and types of housing which meet the actual needs of current and future residents should be central to every land use decision jurisdictions make. So that raises the question that, again, Dana brought up. If cities and counties have to be doing this, then why is there an affordable housing crisis? Well, here's some of the barriers that we often hear about when it comes to the development of affordable housing. Procuring funding, money is always a struggle, especially as the cost of construction has continued to increase everywhere. Available land, especially in a market that's as hot as Oregon, finding land that is relatively inexpensive to make affordable housing pencil out, again, always a difficulty. But probably the biggest thing that we hear about is NIMBYism, not in my backyardism. So we see this in terms of people coming to community meetings and advocating against needed housing based on fears of what that housing will do to the community. And so here's some red flags for discrimination against needed housing types. They're very often fear-based, based on, again, who's going to live there. They're very often based on misconceptions. Misconceptions based on, for instance, what they remember public housing being like in the 60s and 70s. When in reality, public housing, publicly subsidized housing, has not looked like that in a very long time. You know, we're not talking about the massive residential towers that were, you know, that are unattractive, brutalist structures that that we remember public housing looking like in the 60s and 70s. They don't look like that anymore. I mean, more often than not, they're beautiful structures that are built to the exact same standards that that, you know, traditional housing is. So what is it going to look like? Will it last? Absolutely. There's a fear of the effect on home values. That's one that comes up all the time. In reality, there is plenty of research that shows that the more economically diverse a neighborhood is, the more economically vibrant it is. Very frequently, a more inclusive community is actually going to improve home values for the single family homes that are there. So this idea that it's going to depreciate home values, it just simply, you know, is not true. The only time that happens is, again, when you concentrate affordable low-income housing that's when it happens. And the same thing can be said for the next point, this fear of increased crime, this thinking, this myth that affordable housing, bringing in public housing is going to increase crime rates in the neighborhood. In fact, there is solid research that when you bring in affordable housing, that crime rates citywide actually decrease. Yeah, it's just simply not true. You get the rare instances when you do get increased crime rates associated with public housing are, again, when you concentrate public housing in areas that have low economic opportunity. In reality, places that have broad diversity of economic types and protected classes are very low crime areas. And then there's the magnetism myth, the idea that if you build this housing, then you're going to bring this problem to you, that you're going to attract people who need this low income housing from other places. In reality, we are never going to meet the needs of low income residents who are already here. It's an unfortunate fact that it doesn't really matter how much low income housing we build. We're still not going to be doing enough for the people who already live here. So the people who are using low income housing as it's being built are by and large people who are already living in the area or who already have ties in the area. And this is a great thing to point out as well. So who uses Section 8 vouchers in Oregon? Well, it's 61,000 households. 50%, over 50% are families with children, and about 20% are seniors, and 30% are people with disabilities. So public housing, affordable housing, Section 8 housing, all of this allows for seniors to age in place. They get to actually stay in their communities if they're getting supported housing. It allows people with disabilities to stay in their communities. And it allows children to have a safe and stable housing, which is absolutely vital to them, succeeding in school and having better outcomes in the long run. All of that is really important. So in many ways, public support for housing and affordable housing, it really keeps communities together. It's what keeps communities afloat. And making sure that people who have these NIMBY attitudes understand that, I think, is a really important way to counter their attitudes. And so let's talk about free speech and public decisions. So public decisions about housing, community members, if you cannot convince people with NIMBY attitudes, and they're still going to city council meetings and advocating against their housing, that's their right. That is absolutely their free speech right. They have the right to express opposition to project on whatever basis they want, including a discriminatory basis, as long as it's not illegal intimidation. However, elected officials cannot then cite those discriminatory opinions as being the reason that they are rejecting public housing. So that's the key thing. People can go to community meetings and say whatever kind of hostile, discriminatory stuff they want, but that cannot be the basis for land use decisions. It can't cause a disparate impact on the protected classes that I've talked about. So here's how fair housing laws apply to cities. It prohibits land use regulations, restrictive covenants, and conditional or special use permits. They may limit housing choice based on protected class. So this is how it deals with land use decisions that cities make. So here are some ways that cities can and often do violate fair housing law. they end up requiring projects to undergo additional approval steps, hearings, or meetings with neighbors not required of other housing projects. So for instance, if a permanent supportive housing for people who are recovering from alcoholism, just as an example, if they are making that housing development go through approval processes that other similar housing types are not having to go through, then that's a fair housing violation. Requiring those projects to have extra screening, setbacks, or design modifications, anything that makes the process more burdensome or costly is a fair housing violation. And requiring burdensome public safety requirements. If you're making your multifamily developments, which have a lot of Section 8 recipients, get security guards, and you're not requiring other developments of that type, again, to do that, then that is a fair housing violation. So, lesson number 3, help resistant community members to understand how a new housing will help meet the needs of the whole community, including neighbors they might not know exist. But also remind policymakers that prejudicial comments from the public are not adequate reasons to reject a project. And we're just about to wrap up, but first a little bit about some real current land use reforms, because this was a really productive session of the Oregon State Legislature. So we had House Bill 2006, and that requires the permitting, or requires allowing the permitting of emergency shelters, and this goes through July of 2022. So it doesn't matter if it's in a zone that traditionally would not allow for an emergency shelter. Cities have to allow it as long as they meet the restrictions of the law. Same thing for House Bill 3261. It requires cities to permit hotels and motel conversion into shelters or affordable housing. It doesn't matter if it's in a zone that traditionally would not allow shelter housing or affordable housing. They have to accept it as long as the people who are creating that shelter, who are managing that shelter, are going through the process of meeting the standards laid out in the law. And then Senate Bill 8, this was a big one, requires cities to allow certain affordable housing development on non-residential lands. So if the city has surplus lands that aren't zoned residential, there are still housing types that can and must be built on those lands. So the common theme there is that these are housing decisions. The state is acknowledging, right, that there is a fundamental breakdown in the land use system. Because of NIMBYism, because of cities not upholding their responsibilities to create needed housing, they are taking some of these processes out of the land use system altogether. And they are requiring cities to just allow it as long as it meets the standards necessary. And then one more thing that I threw in there was restoration of affirmatively furthering fair housing rules. These are rules from Housing and Urban Development. It's from the 1968 Fair Housing Act. And what it essentially says is that HUD and anyone that gets money from HUD, so basically all jurisdictions, are held to a higher standard. Simply not perpetuating new discrimination isn't enough. They also have to roll back existing patterns of discrimination and segregation. So things like House Bill 2001, House Bill 2003, this is a great opportunity. This is a once in a generation opportunity for jurisdictions and communities to actually affirmatively further fair housing, to show that they're meeting their needs by introducing diverse new housing types into areas that have economic opportunity. So really, really big deal. And FHCO as an organization is here to help in your advocacy processes. We are here to help you look at the code and zoning changes through a fair housing lens. If there's things that you have questions about, send it our way. And if you think, oh, hey, this might be discriminatory, please let us know. We'll help you identify discrimination. We can help with education if there are if there are jurisdictions who are making discriminatory decisions. We can provide trainings for them. If you are from an advocacy group and you want your members to have a training, we can do that as well, and we can provide fair housing material. And then if it comes down to it, we will try and give you all the tools that you need to be able to advocate for yourselves. But if it comes down to it, we also can and will provide advocacy and enforcement services. So great example that I like to bring up is Lakeview. So from Lake County, it's a Southern Oregon community. Last year, we directly intervened because they were blocking the development of housing, which happened to be for of permanently supportive housing for people who had addiction. And it was done entirely on the basis, it was very clear it was done entirely on the basis of NIMBY attitudes from community members and city council members. And we got that decision overturned. So it works. If it comes down to it, we or groups that we work with can and will intervene and make sure it goes through. And I have run over a little bit, but I think now I'm turning it back over to Dana.
Thank you, Samuel. Thanks for bringing us through so much history in such a short time. Did you want to chime in?
Actually, we, pardon me, we had a couple of questions. Matthew had a question for Samuel, and then there were a couple other questions in the chat. But I'm going to give Matthew a chance to ask his question first.
Hi, thank you very much. As a former housing navigator and such, what I found working with my clients, either my clients or people would be like, oh my gosh, why do these people on Section 8 or low income housing, why do they get such nice upgraded housing while mine is falling apart, this and that? And as I listen to your slides, I agree with everything, but there's also that envy and that greed attached to, well, why do they deserve better? What's your response back to that, and how do we overcome that? Or what message do we give to overcome that?
Good question. So this is in terms of like new housing development that they're
Yeah, so I mean, here in Southern Oregon, Jackson County Housing Authority, both here, some places here in Grants Pass, as well as in Jackson County, they've expanded even in Fruitdale Drive in our area. Some of that area is low-income housing, beautiful townhouses and such. Certainly much more beautiful than mine, which is fine. But I find a lot of people saying, well, why do the low income, or why do those on Section 8, why do they get so much better housing than I? What did they do to deserve it? And, it's obviously, it comes from greed. It comes from, envy, but I think that's almost as big of an issue as not in my backyard. But I don't have a good answer for how do we address that every single person still deserves to have stable housing. And it doesn't matter whether or not, aesthetically it looks better.
Yeah, I mean, I would suggest, advocate for expanding Section 8. I mean, I think that there's plenty of people who qualify for Section 8 who are not getting it, and it probably should be expanded because the housing crisis is such where it is probably the quickest and most direct way to address those types of housing needs. Otherwise, advocate for high quality housing in your neighborhood that you do qualify for if you're not on Section 8. It's something that we all benefit from as a community, to have all community members housed in high quality housing.
Thank you so much, Samuel. And I can see that there are other questions coming up. We are hoping to leave a large question and answer portion at the end and just get through a little bit more presentation. And then I also know that some folks in the chat are really eager for all of this information. And as Nicole said in the beginning, we are going to send out resources after the presentation, after the webinar. And I think that the Fair Housing Coalition has like a really awesome guide for how to be a neighbor and how to bring fair, accessible housing into your community. So I would just encourage anyone who's interested to definitely fill out the Neighbors for Neighbors link. Okay, so yeah, now that we have talked a little bit more about the requirements for affordable and accessible housing, I wanted to bring it back to how we can ensure that our decision makers, our electeds, are actually following those expectations. And as we discussed earlier, you know, if we aren't showing up and advocating for ourselves and our communities, other folks will be in the room, and those voices will come across louder than the folks that are being impacted. So we're gonna just talk about some ways to make and amplify your experience and your voice just for a few minutes. And when I use the term local government, I'm referring to usually a city council meeting or a county commissioner body. And of course, there are other decision-making bodies as well, but that's kind of what I'm referring to in this space. And an example of a upcoming policy that would really impact affordable housing in Grants Pass in particular is the proposal of a construction excise tax in Grants Pass. And a construction excise tax or a CET is a tax on all construction permits, and money from that tax would be used to build workforce housing, low-income housing, and related programs. And it's one of the few direct tools that cities have to address a lack of affordable housing. And although there's currently no actual proposed legislation, it's in the discussion process right now. And this is a really important time to provide input and support as city councilors are discussing this possibility. So if there is an issue that community members want to either express support or opposition to, such as in this case, a construction excise tax, one of the ways to do that is to write or call your electeds. Also, you are welcome to show up at city council or county commissioner meetings. And I have some slides later that talk about when those meetings are for Josephine County. And again, Nicole will follow up with that information as well. But just a little information about what speaking in those spaces looks like for folks that maybe haven't yet. So public comments are allowed and time is allotted for them at county commission and city council meetings. And that is the time to share your thoughts, ideas, and experiences. And although talking to decision makers can be intimidating, they're just people, and it is their responsibility to listen to the folks that put them in these positions. So just keep that in mind throughout. Usually comments have to be kept to just a few minutes. So making sure that you think about what you're going to say ahead of time, even write out the key points that you want to get across can be really helpful. When you're thinking about what you want to share, sharing personal experiences is obviously very powerful. For anyone who was at the first part of this series last Monday, I think anyone who is there can attest to just the power of personal stories. And oftentimes those will stay in the minds of electeds more so than just numbers. That being said, remember to stay on topic and use the time that you have wisely. It's easy to begin rambling when you are nervous or aren't used to being in that position. So again, knowing ahead of time what you want to get across, and then having a clear ask to decision makers. So even if you don't know, any technical policies that you are asking for, just clearly stating the need for more affordable housing. It's important that comes across really clearly what you want from folks. Yeah, and of course, like I said in the beginning, remember to relax. They are just people up there, and it's their job to listen to their community. And we do have a couple, I think maybe a city council member in the room, and definitely some staff from the city. And I'm going to go to the next slide, which has some important upcoming meetings. And then Amber or Vanessa, if you wanted to hop in here, you are welcome to.
Hello, I'm Amber. I'm the Housing and Neighborhood Specialist here at Grants Pass. I do want to invite people to come to these meetings that are listed up here. The construction excise tax that was just talked about, that one will be on the 17th. And the strategic planning, that's a really important one. That is when the city council decides on their big ticket goals that they're looking for the next year. And so being there to represent that housing, specifically affordable housing, should be up there in the goals, and having sub-specific goals about that is a really strong support. We also do have an opening on the Housing Advisory Committee. So if you're interested in that, feel free to check out there was a link posted in the chat, and I can post it again. And in terms of upcoming meetings, you can always find information and agendas for upcoming meetings on the City of Grants Pass website under the agenda section on the homepage, and just click into the agenda and see if there's something related that you're interested in that you want to represent, and check that often. And scroll down, there's different committees as well.
Thank you so much, Amber. Appreciate that. And as Amber said, yeah, anyone is welcome to show up at any time. And I think can be helpful to just show up at a meeting, even if there's not something on the agenda want to follow in particular. It's just kind of helpful to feel more comfortable in those spaces. And then at the top of this list, I did want to mention, kind of circle back to what Samuel was talking about during his presentation about talking with your neighbors and community members about what you're seeing and what you want to see in your community, because ultimately those attitudes and sentiments around either building or blocking affordable housing have an immense impact on whether those projects are built and move forward. And then we have a few more options for plugging in. Actually, we have a lot, and I'm just going to highlight a few so that we can get into our question and answer. As we've said a couple of times, signing up for the Neighbors for Neighbors news letter. I have the city council and county commissioner meeting times listed here. The Fair Housing Council also has a newsletter, and the Rogue Action Center does as well. And then also the Rogue Action Center has a policy watch team. And our goal is really to collectively monitor policies that are coming forward through city councils and through commissions throughout the valley, so that we can better respond to decisions that are going to be impacting us all. So if you're interested in that, feel free to reach out to me, and Nicole will send my contact info as well. And then, a couple other options listed here. Just different organizations that are doing this work. If you're very interested and want to get into this work, the Community Alliance of Tenants is actually hiring a Southern Oregon organizer. And again, this will all be sent out. And I think at this point, I will open it up for questions. Amber, did you want to hop in for a minute?
Yeah, I just wanted to also say that if you hear about projects that are coming up that are being supported by foundations, like Foundry Village is being supported by All Care Foundation, reach out to those foundations and express your appreciation, because they also get pushback from the community, and it really helps for them to hear the thankfulness from the community.
Thank you. And let's see, if folks want to raise their hands, we could do it in that way. And also, Sally or anyone else that's been moderating this, if there are questions that you've seen that you want to bring to the forefront, that would be great as well.
I did just want to mention that I put the Good Neighbor Guide in the chat that you can download. You can also find it on our website, and it gets kind of into it's short, but it gets into all the nitty gritty about what the obligations of jurisdictions are around housing, and how you can personally intervene in the process and make sure that it gets built.
I see Vanessa's hand.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to really quickly just provide some insight. I think Amber did a really great job. So thank you, Amber, for being here this evening and offering some of those suggestions. Her last point that she made about being vocal and showing up even when you agree. Sometimes it's easy to say, well, I agree with what's going on, so everything's working wonderfully. And, in a sense, kind of tuning out. But I think more than anything, that's almost when folks need to show up and let decision makers know that you support their decision, because there can be a lot of pushback that maybe is unseen. So knowing that they have support is really important, because oftentimes that pushback is from those who benefit from the status quo. I did also want to plug for 1000 Friends of Oregon. There's a really phenomenal class that can be taken. It is free, and it's the Land Use Leadership Initiative. And it does help folks really understand the nitty gritty of the land use laws in Oregon and how you can become an effective advocate for them in your own community to kind of help in a sense, so that you can have your community developed in a way that benefits everyone and not just those, just not a small portion of the community. When testifying on a land use issue, it's very important to stick to the criteria that's being determined. I know it was a little touched on earlier that sometimes you'll hear emotional testimonies that people are afraid of crime and these types of things, but oftentimes for land use issues, those are not criterias. The criterias are held in the development code. So sticking to that and testifying in support of that is effective. And I think staying connected to allies is really important. Attending meetings like this, sharing emails, and staying connected when things come up is a way to build a strong network of folks to have things move forward that you support. And always physical testimony, in my opinion, is more impactful than written testimony. So if you're able, you can get time off work, you can get childcare, whatever your situation is. If you can come physically to a city council meeting or a county commissioner meeting, or maybe one of the committee meetings, and testify in person and put a face to the comment, I think that that's always more impactful. So that's my 2 cents, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that anyone may have if needed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for sharing. Appreciate that. We appreciate that. Do other folks have questions?
And feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question that you'd like to pose.
I saw a question earlier about whether my slides were going to be available. I will create a slide deck and send it to whoever is doing the follow-up. I don't know if that's you, Sally, but I'll make sure that it gets out.
If you would like the slide deck and more information, the best thing to do is sign up for the Neighbors for Neighbors newsletter and such, and that's a good way to stay in touch. You can put your information in the chat. You can do it privately to myself or Nicole Sellinger, and we can follow up with you that way. This evening's event, as well as last week's event, will be on the Rogue Community College Diversity Programming Board's website, so you can watch that at a later time as well. I do see, there's been so many messages, but somebody did have a question about what happened with the urban campground. Is anyone here tonight able to speak to that?
Yeah, I can. So the urban campground effort went forward and was proposing a site to develop into an urban campground on N Street. And it was, I led the effort on choosing a site, and I did a rather poor job, and I ignored the reality that it was close to a school. And then quite a few neighbors complained about that. And the city council, I think wisely, were sort of the thought that we needed to rethink the process of where and how we choose a site. And so we're going to take a step back or two and create a process where we look at various sites in town and try to find an evaluation process and come up with another site that's maybe not so close to schools. And that's about where we're at. The city council is sort of got two decisions to make with the urban campground, which is how it's going to give money to another entity to buy and develop a campground. That's sort of one decision. And then the second decision is how involved is the council with the choice of the land, and then how to make that choice of the land. So the council definitely needs input from others if they're interested in saying, at the very least, you're either in favor or not in favor of an urban campground, which is a campground for homeless people that is it has rules and regulations and is staffed and manned 24 hours a day by 2 people. Rogue Retreat out of Medford will operate it here in Grants Pass. So the council does need to hear about it, hear about your not necessarily your ideas on it, but whether you're in favor of it or not, because there is pushback from that, and there will be pushback at the next site we find as well. That's it. I do have another point I wanted to bring up, if it's possible. So I'm on the Housing Advisory Committee, and a couple of people have said that there's a vacancy on that. I think Amber put that out. We have a vacancy for somebody who is a renter. I would love it if somebody applied. The vacancy's been there for a few months. We hadn't had any applications yet. So if you're interested in being involved with that committee, we meet once a month, and you don't have to have technical expertise. You just need to be present, be willing to learn about what's going on. And we need people to apply. So if you're interested, either reach out to me or Amber Neal, or go to the city website and look for applying for committees there. And then the other thing I wanted to add was the city over the next year or two is going to be doing a lot on housing issues. There's a number of new council members that are really interested in working on housing issues, and they're pushing the housing committee to come up with solutions and ideas. And we're talking about the construction excise tax. this week. We'll be talking about it again in the future. And we're going to also start talking about a minimum density, which is a sort of a detail-oriented thing. It forces higher levels of development in properties versus just the standard sprawling single-family houses. And it's a very effective tool for getting more apartments built. The city's going to be considering that in the near future. So please pay attention to that one and voice your opinion. That's it. Thanks.
Hey, Doug, I have a question for you.
Yes.
Doug Walker. Yes. Is there a particular reason why they had pushback on the development of that urban campsite near school? Is there sex offenders involved in that urban campsite, or is there any particular reason?
Yeah, the proximity to the school. It was less than 600 feet to the school, and then the fear was bringing homeless people into an area near the school, and there's no guarantee that some of them are not sexual offenders. So yes.
Got it. Okay. So it sounds like maybe we need to start looking at maybe a separate urban campsite for people that are registered sex offenders. So that way the homeless community that are registered sex offenders may have a place to go as well.
Yeah. I started today and had a phone meeting with parole and probation and their officers that handle sexual offenders, and trying to work out the details and trying to synthesize. It's quite a detail. There's an awful lot to it, and trying to synthesize that down to some rules that could be implemented in the operations of the facility. The problem right off the top of my head with what you said is it's very expensive to create a campground. It's to pay 2 staff 24 hours a day is a big price tag. And so it's going to be difficult to have 2 campgrounds. It's just very expensive. So because of that,
sorry, go ahead, Doug.
Because of that, it probably wouldn't happen.
Yeah, because what I was thinking is because we shouldn't, punish everybody that's homeless that may not be registered sex offenders because of a few that are, and they're now inconvenienced, have to, wait on a process because of those few.
Correct.
Not to sound discriminatory or anything, people make mistakes, whatever, but it sounds like everybody kind of falls under that same category as the ones that are registered.
Correct.
And that's not really fair to them, right, Doug?
That is correct. I agree with you. And so there's sort of two the main solution is if we can find a way of saying this type of sexual offender, because there's lots of different types of sexual offense and offenders, can't be anywhere in this facility. We'll maybe do that. It's hard to figure out how to do that operationally.
Right, because there's families that are going to be involved in this urban encampment, right? Families with children, maybe adolescents or, teenagers, whatever group they may fall under. They're still going to be a part of that urban campground, which will house, sounds like, the sexual offenders as well. So that's also a security problem too, right?
Correct. And we have to work through those issues. Yes.
Okay.
We'll have to figure out exactly how they're doing it in Medford. Yeah.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. This is such a good conversation, and I'm really glad these connections are being made. That's definitely what this huge part of what this event is about. And I just want to make sure that just because we have a few more minutes, I noticed that Valerie had their hand up, and I just wanted to see, Valerie, if you still had a question. I believe you are on mute.
Your microphone does not appear to be working.
Valerie, would you mind typing your question into the chat?
Okay, so Valerie wrote, I just wanted to add that today council discussed having a roundtable discussion soon with All Care Foundation.
I can chime in here and just add to that since Valerie's having trouble with her audio. So Valerie is one of our city councilors and I'm the mayor here in Grants Pass. And we she's back. I'll let you go, Valerie.
No, I just wanted to say, yeah, I guess it's because I had my earphones in, figured it out. I just was going to say that it's definitely a priority of ours. We are moving forward with it. We saw this is all a learning experience. And so it's highly on our agenda. And we do want to work with All Care. So that's what I'm saying is this is a process, but we're working hard. There's also another discussion going on about the possibility of a warming center. So all of these things are high on our agenda, and I will say the same thing Vanessa said. It's really important that you get down and have put your word in. Being there does make a bigger difference. So, and don't be afraid because we're not scary. So come on down to the council meetings.
Thank you for saying that, Valerie. With that, I want to invite everyone. Doug did you want to say one more thing, Doug? Or is your hand still raised from last time?
Yeah, I would, please. One more thing. And so for those that are interested and maybe interested in the future in coming down and speaking, you don't have to know all the details about an issue. You don't have to know very many of the details about an issue. You just come down and say, hey, I'm in favor of more housing. I'm in favor of things that create more housing. You don't have to know a lot about any of the details of these things. It just matters that you're there and you're saying, hey, I'm in favor of this or I'm not in favor of this.
That's perfect.
Doug,
Thank
you
you for
talked about that advisory council thing, and you mentioned once a month, but what is the day and time that's held?
Give me a minute. I'm looking it up here on my calendar. It's this coming. Oh, I think it's this coming Friday at 11. Give me a second here. I'm going to pull up my calendar. It's a reoccurring third Friday, 9 a.m. It usually runs from 9 a.m. to 11, third Friday of the month.
I might say, and no disrespect to the mayor and the council or anybody else on that, but those type of hours really restrict those of us who are renters who have to continue working to pay our rent to, I have to remove myself from even considering because of those business hours. And I get it. There's lots of meetings that happen in the evening and such, but I think that's something that we have to consider is how do we hold these meetings in a productive manner and get the constituents that we need and want while not removing us from the workforce so that which threatens us not to be able to pay our rents.
I'll bring that up with the committee because the committee could choose its own hours and see if there may be some appetite for changing to evenings or end of day timeline. But thank you for bringing that up.
All right, I want to honor time. And before we leave, and I will stay afterwards, for those of you who have continued questions or want to continue the discussion, thank you so much, everyone who came this evening, and particularly to the Rogue Action Center and Fair Housing Council of Oregon and RCC for wonderful presentation, and for all of our elected officials and community members who have come. There is a link to a survey feedback if you would like to give feedback on tonight that Sally posted in the chat. I am hoping to go to the city council meeting this Wednesday to talk on the construction excise tax that was mentioned. And as Doug and Valerie stated, you don't need to know all the ins and outs, but if you would like to know some of the ins or outs, I'm happy to stay after and talk to people about how to write a letter specific to that issue that is coming up this Wednesday, or how to show up this Wednesday. I've never spoken to the Grants Pass City Council either, so we would go together. And lastly, again, if you have been inspired, would like to be kept in touch with about upcoming events, volunteer opportunities, especially as we hope to have a warming shelter coming up here this winter. other opportunities to be engaged, please do take a moment and sign up for the Neighbors for Neighbors list. And with that, thank you. Any last words from anyone else? I will again stay on.
We're so appreciative to have you all join with us tonight. Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.
And have a good night. Please do stay if you'd like to have some additional conversation.
Pat had asked whether